Hi guys, welcome back to Schauer Thoughts. My name is Sarah Schauer. This is a podcast for left and right brainers, middle brainers, anyone with the pons, medulla, corpus callosum. If you got nerve, welcome to this podcast. By the way, I have done an episode on the neuro myth of left and right brain. You're not really left or right brained. It's like more creatively inclined activities, more right side, more analytical left side. However, you do use all parts of your brain. It's like really not like you're not really like, oh, I'm only using the right side of my brain. So if anyone is like, well, I've done an episode on this neuromyths. I think it was like a year ago. Welcome back. What are we talking about this week? Well, this originally started with the Maha report and going through it and RFK Jr. just being ridiculous. I called him a grifter last time and people are like, why? It's like, well, if you look into the type of lawyer that he is a sue and settle lawyer, which is like suing someone with the intention of financial compensation as opposed to like criminal time, like prison time or like criminal charges. He's like a civil, like mass tort personal injury lawyer. And so like before he started working directly in the Trump administration, he just had so many ties to like personal injury law firms, like some of the biggest in this country. So whenever people are reviewing the Maha report, they're like, he seems for things and against things, but he also is in a, government, like he's in a position of power. He does have the capacity, I mean, maybe not immediately, to make some of these so-called substances or like practices illegal outright, but he's not. And that is interesting. And it's like, well, once he gets out of the White House, he's most likely going to have some information on all the horrific stuff the Trump administration did to people's health, and he's going to have insider information for his buddies. Yeah, he's just going to take advantage of this. He's like a setup guy, where it's like you plan, you lure, and then you're the informant. So that's like his MO. And the thing is a lot of times when people are looking at corrupt politicians, you kind of are like ideating, like what are these like new novel ways that they're going to try to screw over the public? They basically they're too stupid to like come up with their own new plan altogether. So everyone just kind of recycles what they did before they got into office, and they perfect their methods. Because the thing is the 1%, a lot of these corrupt politicians run in the same circles. They've been in government, they've been in power for like since they've been alive, and so they pretty much all know each other, and they're like swapping like methodology and insight. So it's like you don't really have to come up with new methods when it comes to what stunt they're all going to pull. It's just basically like what was the previous MO, and then look at who else is in the cabinet and be like, that was their MO. So like with those like ways that they operate and make money, steal from the public in a quote legal way, you just kind of like find out like, oh, this is probably, if this is going to serve his purpose, they're probably going to have to go this route. Anywho, RFK Jr. is just a grifter who is kind of hoping that a bunch of people get hurt. So then I have just been in my year of medicine, which means for anyone new, I read a lot of nonfiction. I don't claim to be an expert. If I do talk about health stuff, take it all to your licensed care physician, right? Take it to your mental health person, take it to your doctor. I'm giving sources so you can check it out for yourself. Don't just straight up trust anyone just because they said trust me or whatever. I provide the sources so you can look through them. Anywho, so I'm in my year of medicine, which means I'm reading about medicine. I'm in autoimmune chronic conditions, and a lot of women have chronic conditions, especially when it comes to like immune system stuff. And I was, just thinking, I believe women. And if a bunch of women are telling me whenever I go to the doctor, they tell me that my pain isn't real and that I'm anxious and all this stuff, that it's my fault or whatever. And I'm like, first off, I will always be on the side where if a bunch of women are telling me that there's a certain issue with a certain group of people, I'm right off the bat going to believe them. Because I mean, historically, if you look at a lot of issues that have related, not just exclusively to women, but where a lot of women are involved, it means that there's a lot of men involved trying to like delegitimize or like, make them seem crazy. So I've gone on this deep dive, and we're now on the Monsanto company. You should watch the previous 2 or 4 episodes, because this is like now a multi-part series. I don't know when it's going to end, but I talked about, the Carter administration, how the Carter administration, he just kind of put a whole bunch of executives in his cabinet. And so he's got Coca-Cola and Monsanto up his and I've also just been talking about like why I think women of childbearing potential were excluded from clinical research in 1977. I will be saying that again. I know I keep saying that, but like it really is super important to discuss like what happened and like to actually assign accountability to the people, the companies, organizations that were in charge of excluding women from clinical research. It's like there's also, I've been looking into, oh my gosh. environmental hazards and stuff like that, and toxicology and stuff, and the statute of limitations. There's something else I'm working on where it seems like every person with a chronic condition has to wait 10 to 12 years to get diagnosed. And then I was looking at statute of limitations when it comes to like sort of environmental pollutions, pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, PVC, right? And it's like you only have 2 to 4 years, depending on the state, to actually pursue charges, like sue. But it's like the discovery rule is like 2 to 4 years from when you discovered the illness. But when you think about the turnaround time for it takes if you're trying to connect a chronic condition to like some environmental toxin, there's a whole lot of like research, environmental testing that has to be done, like a whole bunch of like testing internally with you until you can like establish like this is what made me sick or this furthered my illness or something like that. So it's just like there's something in my mind that says I need to look up statute of limitations. I mean, for like when they were established for environmental toxicology, like diseases, related diseases. And it does, of course, go back to the Toxic Substances Act of 1976, which we will be talking about. But yeah, I'm not saying by any means that every single chronic condition, every single like reproductive issue, every single endocrine issue, etc. Are they all solely caused by environmental toxins? Absolutely not. There's also, you must consider genetics, you must consider stress, you must consider age. There's so many other factors. However, when it comes to the part that is largely unaddressed by the government and a lot of like medical professionals, it has to do with toxins for consumer products and the environment. And there's not a lot of regulations with the FDA. A lot of times if a product is like faulty or contaminated or something, recalling is pretty much on a voluntary basis. I mean, it is kind of like a goodwill sort of thing where if like a company is like, oh crap, there is salmonella in this raw milk. Who would have thunk? It's like if you have a voluntary like honor code system for a lot of companies who are making hundreds of millions and billions of dollars and they realize one of their products is making people monumentally ill, why would they recall it? Because they know that like how the way that the law is set up, like all these people are gonna have to test the soil and they're gonna have to do some genetic testing and they're gonna have to do blood panels and they're gonna have to do, maybe they might even do a spinal tap or something like that. But it all this shit really started to become incredibly corrupt with Gerald R. Ford, who was the president right before Jimmy Carter. We know that Nixon and Reagan were bad. Gerald R. Ford, not as, but he did set up the Carter administration to deal with a lot of stuff because, you know, when it comes to like the Industrial Revolution and the creation of like, well, not the creation of, because pesticides, insecticides, herbicides have been around for a while, like ways to mitigate like pest sort of damage in agriculture. Like around the time of the Industrial Revolution, especially around World War II, manufacturing and then industrial sort of like pollutants really seriously came on the scene. So it kind of came to a head in the 70s because a lot of people, especially women, were realizing, hey, a lot of us are ill. A lot of us are really, really ill. And, there's a bunch of news stories coming out about like, PVC, PVC, all the plastics and things in the 70s. So for everyone who's new here, 1977, they said they banned women from clinical research because of the thalidomide tragedy, which was this morning sickness sort of pill. And it ended up causing a lot of birth defects but it actually goes much deeper than that. It's not just thalidomide. And with me today, I have a whole bunch of databases. I'm so excited. You have no idea. So for anyone also new here, I'm a big research person. I love a good database. Last time I talked about Retraction Watch, which is like how you look up retracted papers, and then I talked about Good Jobs First, which is how you look up, there's violation trackers, there's like attacks, there's like subsidy trackers, like you can track like all the sort of like corruption for different companies. Talked about food politics is like how do you, really orient yourself, because a lot of like food information is completely destabilizing. It's like, this is good for you, this isn't good for you, this is, no. These two perfectly qualified people somehow have like difference of opinions on bananas. And so Food Politics First is it's a website managed by Marion Nestle, who's a master of public health, who talks about like the different types of like food research. So I just gave a whole bunch of like information, and now I have a whole bunch of database information here to share with y'all. And then we're going to get into how Mr. Jimmy Carter was a big old, what word is that? What word is appropriate? Pushover? Pushover, find in your mind, find the worst synonym for pushover. And that's what Jimmy Carter was for the industrial sort of like manufacturing oil company and then a lot of agricultural companies. Like he just basically was there. Fill in that word for me. With that, I was talking about a couple episodes ago, Sweet and Deadly, How Coca-Cola Spreads Disinformation and Makes Us Sick by Murray Carter, which I recommend. Coca-Cola has been spreading, billions of dollars of misinformation throughout the years. And why this is important is because like medicine, and especially with the Maha report, everyone's always like, what have you not done? What have you not eaten? What have you not tried? What have you not, especially for people with like chronic conditions, it's like putting all the responsibility on the individual. And then I went through the Good Jobs First report where I was like, would you like to see Monsanto's violations that they've had just in the past 8 years? They literally had like a $500 million issue with the state of Oregon in 2022. The violation said for poisoning the state of Oregon for the past 90 years. That's just a violation. Okay. And then is sugar good for you? Is sugar bad for you? How do we feel about carbs? Everyone's like, please. I don't care. I don't care what you eat, drink, or consume. I have a history of addiction. Why is that relevant? I'm very much a harm reduction, sort of like informed consumption person. There's been a lot of misinformation about sugar and about food. And so I like informed consumption. If you, right now, are drinking a liter of Coke, I do not care. Will I kind of judge you because Coca-Cola had a large hand in banning women from research and sexism is bad? Yes. But when it comes to the sugar, I'm just telling you, informed consumption, right? Like what this could do to you. So Coca-Cola has spread so much misinformation on sugar. It makes sense. Everyone's confused. I didn't know that this was, yeah. And then their buddies with Monsanto. Monsanto is like this a large chemical corporation. It was, in the past 10 years, bought by Bayer. And Bayer was like, oh my God, you guys are getting sued by everyone because of glyphosate in your pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, sort of like, and then Bayer took them on, but Bayer has a huge history. So Monsanto, Coca-Cola are like, when you get into corporate corruption in the United States, everyone goes through, I'm learning, a Coca-Cola Monsanto phase. Like you're gonna have to, because I talked about in the last couple episodes, the banning of like cyclamate, the saccharin laws. Jimmy Carter is in office and now like, okay, we're coming up on the time where we said that we need you to test saccharin, like artificial sweeteners, artificial sugars, obviously Coca-Cola uses. And then 1976, we had the Toxic Substances Act, why Coca-Cola and Monsanto are directly involved, because now we get into the manufacturing of plastics, PVC, PBC, some other types of plastics. And I'm just going to tell you this right away. You're going to have a field day. If you want to find out the corruption of the governments and corporations throughout the years, there is this wonderful website you should know called Toxic Docs. And it's basically a database of unredacted, like released corporate memos and toxicology information throughout the years. I think you can go from like 1920s to like on. So I've just been in the 70s and it is horrendous what men say to each other behind closed doors, and especially rich men. But Toxic Docs, if you're looking up, you want to substantiate any report I'm saying, I will include the links to individual resources below. Go to Toxic Docs and you'll find a whole bunch of, if you're in journalism, if you're in research, if you're in medicine, you should go to Toxic Docs. And why I also recommend this is if you're looking for some sort of like gap in medicine, or you're like, I have a feeling like something is like not healthy for the consumer or individual or something in the atmosphere, and you're like, there's no research on it. There probably is research on it, especially controversial stuff. It's most likely been suppressed. Yeah, they are discovering like new things every day. So there's probably not new things on like genuinely new discoveries. But like, for example, if you're like, how do I find out like what type of misinformation has been said about the microbiome? Because a lot of people, for some reason, think gastroenterology is pseudoscience, and it's because if you say gut health, everyone's like, woman. They knew about the microbiome. They knew about all this shit. Just go into Toxic Docs, type in that highly specific term you're looking for, and you're going to see a whole bunch of researchers who were reviewing some substance from some company, and then someone in the government was like, oh my God, it's going to cost us money if we study that. Let's not study it. And here we are today. We're now getting into the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. It's the primary U.S. federal law granting the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, FDA authority to regulate and track commercial and industrial chemicals. The legislation allows the EPA to require testing, issue manufacturing bans or restrictions, and review new chemicals before they enter commerce. So when it comes to like discussing pesticides, insecticides, nutrition, and a lot of people are like, oh, this gets in like a, gray area. I understand that. But the thing is when you talk about like nutrition versus where you can usually see where someone stands is when they talk about nutrition, environment, and then vaccines will be that sort of like area where you're like, all right, in what way are we discussing this? Because the thing is vaccines require much more research before they're put out to the general public. I mean, years, clinical trials, etc., so forth. However, when it comes to like putting out new cosmetics and like food and just sort of like putting things on something, making a new type of plastic bin, companies don't really test what's in the bin or in the sort of thing as well as they should. I mean, yes, they do generally test it because, you do want to have some sort of customer relationship. And if in 20 years, most of your customers have like chloracne, then they're not going to like you and then keep purchasing. Yeah, so people are discovering that they should care about others, but it's only because they don't want to get sued. But like for the most part, when it comes to a lot of like food stuff, they don't really test a lot of stuff. There's like a whole bunch of people putting out raw milk now. And I mean, I know it's illegal in certain states, but like sometimes people just sell it. And it's like, well, see, salmonella is very real. Let's bring that back in, take that off the shelf. But yeah. So when it comes to vaccines, when you're going to tell someone is like generally like an anti-vaxxer, they might tell you. But like usually if you're like looking for subtle signs, they're going to be talking about aluminum, mercury, or formaldehyde in vaccines. That's going to be like their three main things that they're focused on. And then something about bodily autonomy. And yeah, usually if you get like bodily autonomy, don't like the formaldehyde, and autism. Oh, of course. If any mention of autism, you have an anti-vaxxer. That's like where, you can like kind of parse through like who's seriously concerned about environmental sort of toxins and like, hazards that have been untested and there's no research behind it versus like who is very much just like anti-science. Now, I am kind of like, I'm not anti-science, but I'm like looking at this and there are so many scientists obviously who've been paid off by the government, and I can see it in these papers. Like, for example, I was talking about the head of the FDA in 1977 and 1979, only 2 years, was Donald Kennedy. Not related to the Kennedys, just an unfortunate last name. I'm sorry, if you have the last name Kennedy, I'm not judging you. But so Donald Kennedy, right, he's like an actual neurophysiologist. He ended up being the president of Stanford after his time in the White House. But he basically is like forced to resign or fired. I'm not certain. There's like 7. Actually, there's literally something called the cabinet purge that Jimmy Carter did, where he got rid of like a bunch of people that are very much related to the information I'm going to talk about. But like Donald Kennedy, if you go through the toxic docs, you can see him like going up against like every single like major industrial chemical like manufacturer user. He's going up against Monsanto. He's going up against Coca-Cola. He's going up against, I think, General Motors. Like he's going up against so many chemical companies as like a actual scientist in the White House. I think there's at this point like maybe 4 people who are like actually qualified like researchers in the White House at this point, and Donald Kennedy is one of them. He went to Harvard, he taught at Stanford, then he goes to the White House to be head of the FDA. He's like having to now, with Gerald R. Ford and the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, since they go from the Gerald R. Ford administration to Jimmy Carter, the Carter administration immediately takes on the bulk of going through certain toxic chemicals. Not every chemical is toxic. And now he has to deal with that. He's looking at reports from like actual researchers. He's like researching the companies that tested these products. He's like, this is, and then, people are sending him information. Hey, I'm looking over this, one Monsanto thing. And the way that they worded this is not exactly what I said in my report. So this guy, this actual researcher is putting himself on the line, and you're like, oh gosh, fight the good fight. He did. But then also what's interesting, and this is another thing for another. So Donald Kennedy is also studying, saccharin, acrylonitrile, fake sugars, chemicals, plastics, all these things. He's also looking at Agent Orange, which is a herbicide that was dropped in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And so why this is interesting, and I have to look into it separately, this is just a hunch, is that Donald Kennedy, when he gets out of the office, he goes and he's the president of Stanford for 10 years. And then in like 1991 or 92, there's this huge issue where Donald Kennedy has been taking a whole bunch of like research funds, and now he has like a yacht and like a really nice like cars, and he goes on vacation a lot. He's like he's the president of Stanford and they do make a substantial amount of money, but it was like indirect, like sort of like research expenses. And he had like a really nice boats. And so then they did investigation of Donald Kennedy, who's giving him all this research money. It's the United States Navy Research Department. And so the United States Navy, this is just me formulating a hunch, they were very much involved in Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. And so Mr. Donald Kennedy is reviewing all this research that is like carcinogenic mutations, chemical, we dropped it, a lot of different types of diseases. And so he's ousted for, quote, fighting the good fight. 12 years later, found out that he's getting just an endless supply of indirect research funds from the United States Navy. Weird. To me, it seems like he knows something and they're like, shh, don't talk about Agent Orange. But that is speculative. But I mean, I now can find out the answer to that. But yeah, I was going to say that, guys, the hunch that I was thinking about Donald Kennedy being like kind of backed into a wall and like saying like, hey, the only way that if we don't want to find out some horrible effects from these like chemicals, these toxins in the food and water supply and air, we just are going to have to exclude women altogether. My hunch has pretty much been like confirmed with what I found in Toxic Docs. And I'm so excited for you guys to just go through it. It is horrendous. Horrendous. The corporate memos, the suppressed research. Also, by the way, I've gotten into reading about environmental toxicology. I found like a free textbook. I'm going to include the sources to find free textbooks down below. Yes, I will read a free textbook. It's because environmental toxicology is very much important. And when you are in a gray area, when you say the word chemicals in general, it's like, some chemicals are bad. But people like now fear the word chemicals. It's like, well, your body is made of chemicals. I'm learning about which chemicals are actually toxic, and environmental toxicology has been incredibly illuminating. Like I was looking into the grasshopper effect and then how it serves pollutants to people in the Arctic, the significance of the grasshopper effect on atmospheric distribution of persistent organic substances, also looking into bioaccumulation and biomagnification, and then increasingly, sort of concentrated substances. And that's just because I'm generally very interested in science. I love it. But also like when you're reading, about a nightmare to read. In Toxic Docs, when it came to the lawsuits against, it's like a lawyer and like a scientist talking. Talk about a headache. Because the thing is lawyers most of the time are trying to argue like this could mean this, and like trying to like kind of tweak it, make it intentionally vague, whereas opposed like in science you usually want to be incredibly specific for what you're referring to. Monsanto v. Kennedy, because I told you Donald Kennedy got sued by everyone. Going through like him versus lawyer, it's like a headache of just like incredibly straightforward. This is what I observed. And then the lawyer's like, but what if affect the way that this is written, since it was like penned, it could be an E or it could be an A. So it's like, are we arguing that these chemicals affected their endocrine system, or did it affect right? Are we talking? And so it's like, oh my God. So reading the, the book on environmental toxicology, which I'll link below, has just been super nice to understand, because now I'm on chapter 2, plastics, and it says learning objectives, indicate the relevance of plastic for society, describe the main characteristics of microplastics and the main ecological effects of microplastics. You just gotta, sometimes understand what you're saying, or what anyone's saying. So I'm like, hey, fill me in. Okay. So you killed a lot of people is what I'm understanding now that I understand this. And then I also got into the evacuation of Times Beach, Missouri, major chemical industrial disasters in the United States. We will get back to that. So Toxic Substances Control Act, a whole bunch of like companies are now like, crap, we got to register these chemicals that we've been using and spraying, and we got to like test on everyone. And they even made the Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act of 1986. Basically, the entire U.S. government put aside $8.5 billion in a Superfund trust. It's to reinforce the importance of community involvement and cooperation with authorities, create permanent hazard waste cleanup solutions, mandate EPA risk assessments at sites, and the Superfund's national priority list. So the Superfund, Sarah, without an H, I'm not going to judge you if your name is Sarah without an H, but I will say that I always had to buy y'all's keychains at whenever we went to some sort of landmark. Niagara Falls. I remember I was pretty much a klepto, like in 7th grade, and there was a whole bunch of keychain stands, American side, don't worry, would not rob a Canadian, and I stole so many keychains that said Sarah, no H. I don't know what the purpose of that was. I just had an issue, okay? But I have paid my debt to society, I guess. Okay, so Superfund Amendment and Reauthorization Act, Sarah, no H, of 1986, passed October 17th, 1986, to amend the CERCLA or Superfund, which was passed in 1980 to solve the problem of hazardous waste sites. So if you'll remember, women banned from clinical research, 1977. 1980, they're like, oh crap, there is a bunch of hazardous waste. Great. So they're acknowledging it by making a multi-billion-dollar fund to clean up the waste and like discuss like environmental problems. But hey, ladies, you're still cut out of this. We don't want to, your reproductive organs are delicate. Think of the fetus. Think of the fetus. Sarah provides the necessary resources to clean up hazardous waste and lays down emergency plans to follow in the event a hazardous substance is released. The third of Sarah, Title 3, is the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA of 1986, which makes about 300 extremely hazardous substances subject to routine and detailed reporting to designated agencies of the local, state, and federal government. So, fun. This is great. I guess with the Carter administration, they did do some stuff with the help of Donald Kennedy and the other scientists who were willing to tell the truth in the cabinet. Were like, 300 of these, extremely dangerous. Please put them on a list, and we have to clean up toxic waste sites because, like I was talking about, when it came to Missouri, like the Times Beach, Missouri evacuation, entire city of Times Beach, Missouri was evacuated and then unincorporated. Like it's no longer a city. So, for example, this is what this Superfund is now going to. The evacuation of Times Beach, Missouri in 1983, because 1986, was a significant environmental disaster response that resulted in the relocation of its entire population due to dioxin contamination. This small town had been contaminated when a toxic byproduct of the production of Agent Orange was inadvertently spread on local roads to control dust. As health concerns rose, including illnesses among residents and the death of local animals, government officials began recommending evacuation. In February 1983, the federal government utilized Superfund resources to purchase the town and relocate approximately 2,300 to 3,000 residents. The evacuation sparked ongoing debates about the severity of dioxin's health risks, with some officials later suggesting that the danger has been overstated. You evacuated an entire town. No, it's not overstated. However, subsequent studies indicate that dioxins could have serious health implications. They could have. I can now say, I know that scientists listening, you're like, we don't speak in certain terms. You'll speak in certain terms when you go through toxic docs. Look up dioxins, 1970s, 1980s. I can say beyond a reasonable doubt, yes, they are very hazardous. Serious health complications will arise. Yes, so particularly affecting prenatal development and immune system function. So what's great about that, right? So dioxins, prenatal development, so we're talking about gynecological sort of issues. And then immune system function, which is great, because then again, when you consider women banned from clinical research, 1977, and then right after that, they actually, initiate into the United States the field of immunotoxicology. And so they are now talking about dioxins and a whole bunch of chemicals that are not important, right? And there's, prenatal development, immune system function. It'd be nice if we could study what's happening to women, but I guess no. Yeah, the cleanup of Times Beach, which included incinerating contaminated soil, was controversial and faced opposition from environmental activists. By 1997, the cleanup was declared complete and the area was transformed into Route 66 State Park, which later soil tests confirming it was free from contamination. This event highlights the complexities and challenges of environmental policy and public health decision-making. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of toxic substances coming to a head. And then in the 70s, the Vietnam War happens. And anytime there's a war happening, right, World War II, Vietnam, prime examples, is that when a lot of men go to fight, hoorah, right, there's people who need to fill in for their jobs. So a lot of women will go into agriculture, industrial jobs, underwater welding. Sorry, that's for people on TikTok where it's like, what's the hardest job you think you could do? Underwater welding. It is really hard, but like women are getting into these jobs. And so there's a lot of, they're seeing a lot of issues with women's health because of these industrial exposures. So then they're like, crap, a lot of women are now like, we're getting sick. We want to know what's happening, but we also want to keep our jobs. And then Vietnam officially ends 1975. And all these men are coming back to their industrial sort of jobs. And then the people in the White House and government are like, oh crap, we want to find a way to discriminate against women fire them without discriminating against them. I'm being so serious. I'm going to read you something. They're basically like, how do we, fire women, get rid of women in these industrial jobs so men can, get back into the workforce in agriculture, industrial, anything like that. We're specifically trying to discriminate against women of childbearing potential. That's who they're trying to discriminate against. And so if you go through Toxic Docs, you can see inter-organization correspondences. There's like a bunch from like 1977 where it's basically like oil companies, industrial, like chemical companies, plastic companies, agricultural companies, just a bunch of men being like, hey, so we all want to discriminate against women, but we can't because that they just like gave women rights, especially when it came to like, not discriminating in the workforce, like those rights just came along. And so there's a bunch of like men trying to figure out how do we get them out of these women of childbearing potential because like, people are caring about like the fetus and the working woman. And so, yeah, some of the companies included that were trying to get rid of them. For example, you'll see them complaining a lot. Monsanto, DuPont, Shell Chemical, Dow Chemical, General Motors, Borden, Firestone Tire. Go through, you'll find them. How do we get rid of them? And so there is this one toxic doc. It's from Rebecca L. Rowis in Washington. And it's from the 1970s. And it's about reproductive hazards in the workplace. And I'm going to read this. It's 7 pages, very small print. But you're going to get the gist of like, how do we discriminate against women without discriminating against women? So actually, let me just kind of spoil this. So when these women were working in these industrial sort of industries, they tried to, like, the employers with the encouragement of the government. Employers were like, we will hire you, women of childbearing potential, for this job if you can come up and provide scientific evidence that the chemicals you're going to be exposed to, like PVCs, PVCs, like polyvinyl chlorine or whatever, if you can find research that says, hey, you will not get sick because of these like chemicals and these plastic, all this stuff, we will let you work in this field. However, therein lies the rub. 1977, you're not going to find any research on women exposed to these chemicals, as literally the Toxic Substances Control Act just passed year before, where all these companies are now having to register the chemicals. And now you're seeing a whole bunch of like companies realizing, shit, we're going to have to study these effects of these chemicals on women. And you know that research costs a lot. So what would be the most cost-effective way is just ban women from research. And now employers, there's like a degree of separation, are like, okay, we'll hire you in these fields, in these positions, if you can provide research that says this chemical is safe for someone of reproductive age, women with childbearing potential. You're not going to find it because they exclusively banned you from research and they just started researching it. And when it comes to these chemicals, you're going to be talking about long-term exposure. You're going to be talking about like stuff in the air and in the soil. And it's like, there's so many different, you're not going to be able to find that research. And then not to mention 1977, I got to say, no internet, right? So you got everyone in like industrial or agriculture jobs expect to go to local university and then go through their library and find research or, depend on their doctor. And a lot of their doctors are just like, I don't think women should be working in general. If I'm going to give you a hysterectomy, your husband and his mother has to be present. So they're not going to, so yeah. This is Reproductive Hazards in the Workplace. Confrontation over issues surrounding generic protection involves chemical companies, unions, workers, rights groups, and several government agencies. Opening a Celsius. Oh, so my hunch that Donald Kennedy and Coca-Cola had something to do with it is because I talked about last time, acrylonitrile was banned, and it's basically like this type of plastic, and they found that like the plastic things would seep into the Coke. It would actually kind of poison the Coke, and they were like, in every single trial we ran where it's like we stored it in different heats, we stored it for a different amount of time, the plastic is leaking into the Cokes, and you can't serve this because it's like actually carcinogen. It's causing like actually every single type of cancer. And so that's why Coca-Cola, besides like sugar and a whole bunch of other stuff, Fidel Castro, interestingly. So Coca-Cola, every sort of canned beverage, every sort of, everything's in plastic. Pause for a second, look around you. Everything is contained in plastic, especially if you're watching this in the bathroom, you're like, plastic everywhere, right? So like plastic is a huge, huge thing to like now regulate in the US, and Coca-Cola's in the White House. They very much do care about like, hey, if you're saying our bottles are poison, we have spent literally billions of dollars to spread misinformation on just the sugar aspect. Do not make me now have to spin some shit when it comes to plastic. So my hunch is that Coca-Cola, Monsanto, all these like big oil companies, well, it's mainly Coca-Cola, interfered in kind of suggested, hey, let's just not study women, right? Let's just not study women because there's so many different reasons. Like they were literally watching them all go back and forth. Like, how do we deal with this? How do we regulate them without discriminating? But also like my product is cancerous. So like, what do I do? There was this email that got sent to Donald Kennedy. This is from Toxic Docs. And I know I said I was to read something else. I'm going to read a bunch, but like, okay, this is from AIM Packaging Inc. It's September 6, 1977. This is what Mr. Kennedy is dealing with. The Honorable Donald Kennedy, Commissioner of Food and Drugs Administration. They give his address. Dear Dr. Kennedy, 8 years ago, I founded a company that produces plastic bottles, primarily of PVC, and I feel like I have been through a ringer. I am writing to you hoping against all odds that my comments will be weighed as a part of your decision concerning the acrylonitrile beverage container matter, because obviously an FDA position taken in that instance can be presumed to apply to other packaging materials. I have read the arguments on both sides of this issue, the administrative judge's decision, the exceptions to the administrative judge's decision, and now the exceptions to the exceptions, and it is really quite disturbing. This is not prosecution of an issue of great importance to mankind. This is persecution of an improved product. If the situation were reversed, if the roles were reversed, the FDA could not possibly approve a glass or metal package from a standpoint of the Delaney Clause, safety of the package use, the impact statements required, etc. You know, and many of the people within your agency know that nothing, underlined, could pass the test required of this bottle in question. Indeed, probably a few things in the basic food supply, additives, and packaging, notwithstanding, could pass the test if required. Please see the attached article entitled Low Fiber, High Fat Diets Tied to Cancer from the Detroit Free Press, Friday, September 2nd, 1977. And he's like using that as nothing can pass your stringent rules. The actions and inactions of the FDA enforcing and not enforcing the Delaney Amendment amount to a little more than the exertion of power to select which package it likes. Your agency has nearly killed my business over the last 5 years, and we must have relief from this harassment. For fairness' sake, Dr. Kennedy, if what is wanted is a new law to replace the quote Delaney Clause, then have the courage and the integrity to ask for it. The Ashley Bill, H.R. 6979, introduced by Congressman Thomas Ludlow Ashley, would give more than is needed to protect the public health, if that remains the objective of the FDA. Underlined. And then there's a part 2 to this. The Honorable Donald Kennedy. I'm giving President Carter and Secretary Califano a copy of this letter with the hope they will respond and assist. It certainly would be consistent with the promises to reduce the public's and businesses' burden of stifling bureaucracy. We are drowning in regulations or interpretation of regulations that do no one any good and do great violence to some of us in particular. I fervently hope you will see the screwed up logic and twisting of facts by the administrative judge, Daniel Davidson, in this matter of acrylonitrile bottles for Coca-Cola, and either rule in favor of Monsanto or admit the Delaney Clause is an anarchism that should be changed and that you would support such change. Thank you for considering the above. Sincerely yours, AIM Packaging Inc. Frank M. Harris, President. And then he CC'd Jimmy Carter, Joseph Califano, Secretary Joseph Califano, Senator John Glenn, Congressman Delbert L. Latta, Congressman Thomas L. Ashley, Congressman Paul G. Rogers. So like I said, Donald Kennedy, one of the only scientists in the White House at the time, is getting a whole bunch of shit from the plastics industry. And there's a lot of this shit. Just like look up Donald Kennedy in the Toxic Docs. But yeah. And so what is interesting is that he said, for this one in particular, we will get back to the women in the workplace. He said that I'm giving President Carter and Secretary Califano a copy of this. The thing is Secretary Califano is one of Donald Kennedy's only allies in the White House at this time. And weirdly enough, Ted Kennedy and actual Kennedy, right? But separately. Ted Kennedy's separate. But Joseph Califano, he's one of, Donald Kennedy's only allies. Joseph Califano Jr., he is not a scientist, but he is a lawyer who does not give two shits about anyone. Like literally when they kicked him out, they were interviewing him after he went, and he's like, I really don't give a shit. Like I didn't respect anyone in this cabinet. I'm kind of happy. They also released him after 2 2 years. And so like I was talking about earlier, there's something called Carter's Great Purge. It happened, they talked about it in Time magazine, July 29th, 1979. President Jimmy Carter fired or requested resignations from several top officials, most notable during a massive administration shakeup in July 1979. During what was dubbed his cabinet purge, he accepted the resignations of 5 cabinet members. W. Michael Blumenthal, the Secretary of the Treasury, Joseph A. Califano Jr., Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, James R. Schlesinger, Secretary of Energy, who was, the Secretary of Energy was replaced by the old CEO of Coca-Cola. We talked about him the other time. They also got resignation from Brock Adams, Secretary of Transportation, and Griffin B. Bell, Attorney General. So let's look at the positions where he just purged. Secretary of Treasury, Health, Education, and Welfare, and Secretary of Energy, Transportation, Attorney General. So within his cabinet, he also has a whole bunch of people in oil, big oil, and plastics, chemical manufacturing. So when it comes to health, education, welfare, energy, transportation, and then the Attorney General. So Griffin B. Bell, who is the Attorney General, he was progressive, but also incredibly not progressive. He later became an attorney for Exxon when they had like a whole bunch of like oil spills or whatever. So it's kind of like Griffin B. Bell kind of he's very much a play both sides type of guy. So it's like, eh. But Joseph A. Califano Jr., when the plastics company was writing to Donald Kennedy, they're like, I'm CCing the president and Joseph A. Califano Jr. Joseph A. Califano Jr., lawyer, does not give two shits. He's literally going after the military, the United States Navy, for their use of asbestos. And he's the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Like, people threaten him, doesn't care. And he was also like a big proponent of like desegregation. And then he was super interested in addiction, sort of like recovery reform, more focusing on tobacco. And then he found out about the use of paraquat, which is a pesticide in tobacco. And that's where him and Mr. Donald Kennedy are like now linking up, because Joseph A. Califano is like, hey, I'm the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. I don't give a shit about a lot, but I do give a shit that, you know, there's addiction issues in this country, and that health, he was quite progressive in that he was like healthcare, like it's becoming abundantly clear that the issue in healthcare is that a lot of private companies are just prioritizing profit over people. But then if you look into some other stuff he said, it's like, oh my God, it's kind of like that a lot of these people, you should never idolize a politician, never, but like a lot of these people, it's very much like when your parents are trying to be progressive and then they say something incredibly offensive. But anyway, Joseph A. Califano Jr., he's finding an issue with pesticides and Agent Orange and asbestos with the Navy and then tobacco crops. So like when the guy from the plastic company was like, I'm going to CC Joseph Califano on this, Joseph Califano was like reading it like, I'm going to shit on this paper. But then when it came to James R. Schlesinger, Secretary of Energy, he gets kicked out and is replaced by the Coca-Cola guy. So yeah. And then also 2 people did get fired when it came to the cabinet purge. I mean, Jimmy Carter has made a lot of people fire or resign because he is like the little bitch boy for big oil and big agriculture. He's a Georgia boy and he loves Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is based out of Georgia. And so like, for example, he brought on Burt Lance, the Director of Office Management and Budget. So Burt Lance wasn't fired or resigned in 1979. He actually got let go in 1977 because of an ethics issue. But he also let go, Jimmy Carter, he let go of Bella Abzug. She was dismissed as co-chair of the National Advisory Committee on Women in 1979. You can find this in the New York Times. Carter, in angry exchange, ousts Bella Abzug from women's unit. And that makes, total sense. I really should have read the women's health sort of thing. But basically, before Jimmy Carter got into the White House, there's like huge mounting public sort of concern for women's health. And the media is like, why isn't there more research in women's health? And so OSHA from Gerald R. Ford's administration, OSHA is like, safety in industrial workplaces. They like wrote this long ass paper. They were like, we have to address women in industrial sort of, and like agriculture, any places where there's chemical exposure, we do have to address the health concerns. It's very much important. There's pressure from the media, right? Like, these are my proposals. Like, whoever in Gerald R. Ford's cabinet was like, it seemed like they were typing it like, no, dude, this is a serious thing. There's a lot of pressure from, I'm just warning you, this is now your job. And I'm telling you, you are going to have to test some shit. Please test some shit. And then women's rights groups are writing to medical professionals, researchers, women, concerned citizens are writing to the government. Hey, dude, we're noticing that there's cancer in this. And then like, or like this is causing something. And so the guy who was running OSHA put this into a letter. Jimmy Carter gets it when he starts his administration. Fast forward to 1979, Bella Abzug is dismissed from the National Advisory Committee on Women in 1979. She had to endure a lot of shit in that cabinet because not only was she advocating for women, and she was also there when they took women out of research, they were also like, basically she had to watch Jimmy Carter be, suck off everyone in big oil or agriculture. So, and because they wanted to discriminate, right? But like they didn't want to be sued for discrimination. So they were like, hey, Jimmy, can you just ban women from research? That's what Donald said. Meanwhile, Donald's in the corner like, I know you guys are bad. And then they're like, we're suing you. Anyway, so President Carter dismissed Bella S. Abzug January 12th in Washington today as co-chairman of his National Advisory Committee on Women after an angry exchange with a former New York representative at a White House meeting on women's issues. During the meeting, according to a White House official, Mrs. Abzug attempted to lecture the president on his duties of the committee and its role in serving the needs of its constituents. Incensed by this, in a critical press release distributed by the committee in advance of the meeting attacking the impact of Mr. Carter's economic policies on women, the president decided to replace the flamboyant and frequently abrasive Mrs. Abzug immediately. She's automatically like my hero. Okay, unjustifiable action. In a joint statement tonight, Mrs. Abzug and the other co-chairman, Carmen Delgado Vota, said, "We are shocked by this totally unjustifiable action." Mrs. Vota said she was resigning in solidarity with Mrs. Abzug. Earlier in the day, President Carter held a 90-minute meeting with George Meany. Sorry, I can't laugh. My last name is Schauer. President of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. I wonder what they could have talked about. It's beyond me. Later, Mr. Meany and Mr. Carter had, quote, cleared up the question of our relations and communication, but he stopped short of saying he was happy with the president. A reporter who encountered Mrs. Abzug leaving the White House after her dismissal found her in a sour mood. Asked how things were going, she shook her head and said, no good at all. A senior White House aide conceded that Mrs. Abzug had, quote, not been pleased to hear the news. The job is unpaid, but it includes a government-paid staff, office expenses, and, most important for a politician out of office, a forum for which Mrs. Abzug has spoken out on women's issues and other concerns. The sequence of events surrounding the dismissal added a twist to the episode. Late yesterday, White House sources reported Hamilton Jordan, the president's top political aide, received a copy of the highly critical 4-page press release prepared by the committee in advance of the meeting. It accused the administration of being insensitive to the needs of women and especially assailed Mr. Carter's decision to increase defense spending in the upcoming budget at the expense of some social programs. Irritated by the release, the president, according to White House officials, made a tentative decision this morning to dismiss Mrs. Abzug. It was a decision that was reinforced by the meeting itself, one presidential aide said later. Quote, it was really a terrible session, another staff member said. She lit into him in front of nearly 40 other people, referring to Mr. Carter. Hell yeah. The president apparently did not tell Mrs. Abzug at the meeting that he was going to dismiss her, but rather told the committee as a whole that he had been disappointed with the relations between it and the administration. The group was formed in the wake of the stormy National Women's Conference in Houston in November 1977 to advise the president on women's issues. Well, yeah, it's going to be stormy as women are like, hey, we're getting really sick and we're being discriminated against. A lot of these companies just kind of like mandated this rule that we all find research to see if we can breathe in these chemicals or work like other men. But it seems like there is no research. And also I happen to notice that in the same kind of year, you banned women from clinical research. So there actually like is no way that we can find research and we're all getting sick. And like, I know the boys are back from Vietnam, but like we still are, so yeah, of course they're going to be fucking upset. Mr. Carter was reported to have told the members that he recognized the importance of the group and wanted to work more closely with it, but added that its confrontational politics sapped the strength of the administration's effort on behalf of women. It's confrontational. You guys are so confrontational. Well, Jimmy, anything's going to be confrontational when you're used to just getting on your knees and sucking off Coca-Cola. He also was reported to have said that there should be no need for the White House to, quote, cringe in advance of a meeting with a committee set up to provide advice and assistance. They're cringing at women's issues. Oh, I'm cringing. Like Jimmy Carter, like ultimate pick me. Oh my God, guys, I'm cringing. She's mad because we betrayed her and her constituents because we totally screwed women on like a whole bunch of issues. I'm sorry. Do I still have cum on my face? But I'm sorry. I was just like sucking off like 5 people of my cabinet. No, guys, come on. I'm cringing. Literally. Jimmy Carter, he's gone. I don't care. In fact, today's meeting was the first the group has held with the president. So first meeting of the 2 years in. 2 fucking years in. Okay. An earlier session scheduled for last November 22nd was canceled by the women when they discovered that only 15 minutes had been allotted to the president's schedule. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, that these women are mean to you. Carter is applauded. Today's session continued for nearly an hour, and the White House officials reported that when it was over, the other committee members rose and applauded Mr. Carter as he left the room. Then, according to the White House, the committee members drew Mrs. Abzug aside and cautioned her to make a positive statement about the session to reporters waiting outside the West Wing. In fact, she did more. Smiling broadly, Mrs. Abzug said the meeting had been, quote, very good and, quote, very satisfactory, and that the president had been, quote, very generous with his time. Asked if Mr. Carter had succeeded in patching up his differences with the women's group, she smiled slightly and said, quote, well, friendship rides a rocky course. Mrs. Abzug did not realize how right she was. As she was speaking with reporters, a White House aide came out and slipped her a note asking her to return to Mr. Jordan's office. There, she met with Mr. Jordan and Robert Lipschitz, the White House counsel who told her of the president's decision. Bella was told that the relationship with the committee had been neither positive nor productive, and the president felt it required new leadership. A White House official said later, no, wait, oh my God. Sorry, I did not mean to freak you guys out. Sorry, I saw Robert Lipschitz and I was like, no, you're fucking kidding me. It's someone else who we're going to talk about later. I was like, he's here? Then okay, sorry, different guy. Bella was told that the relationship with the committee had been neither positive nor productive and that the president felt it required new leadership, a White House official said later. So letter on removal. She was then shown a terse 2-paragraph letter that applauded the work of the committee but said the president had decided to remove her both as a co-chairman and as a member of the committee. It was signed by Mr. Jordan. White House sources said that a replacement for Mrs. Abzug would be sought soon. A spokesman for Mrs. Abzug quoted her as telling Mr. Jordan that she felt she was being, quote, used as a scapegoat. Yeah. The joint Abzug-Votaw statement said, quote, we believe the administration has made a terrible mistake. It went on to report, quote, shock and indignation on the part of some of the other 30 women who attended the meeting with the president. According to Mrs. Abzug's spokesman, Mrs. Abzug was summoned before Mr. Jordan and told that she was either to resign immediately or be dismissed. Her pleas for time to discuss the situation were not accepted, the spokesman said. So yeah, Mr. Jimmy Carter basically has big industry in his goddamn White House. All right. Let's go back to that original thing. This is by Rebecca L. Rawis, and it says, reproductive hazards in the workplace, confrontation over issues surrounding genetic protection involves chemical companies, unions, workers, rights groups, and several government agencies. The stage is set for confrontation. The overture began in the mid-1970s when workers in plants manufacturing chemicals such as ketone and 1,2-dibromo-3-chloropropane, DBCP, began to complain of being sterile and other reproductive deficiencies caused, they thought, by exposure to these chemicals. The curtain rose late last year when the Department of Labor cited American Cyanamid for work policies which it claimed forced women to be sterilized or lose their job at Cyanamid's Willow Island, West Virginia lead pigments manufacturing facility. At about the same time, a woman in Ohio brought suit against B.F. Goodrich Co. for not allowing her to continue to work in the area where vinyl chloride is polymerized because of the potential risk of chemical exposure to a fetus should she become pregnant. The 1980s as a, quote, decade of genetic confrontation, which one labor leader already is calling it, seems well underway. It is a confrontation that is drawing in many parties. Labor unions and other workers' rights groups are involved. Coalitions of many of these groups are forming. Probably most notable is the Coalition for the Reproductive Rights of Workers, CROW, which pulls together labor unions, women's rights groups, and legal groups concerned with possible violations of an individual's right to fair employment in the name of genetic protection. The federal government also involved through several different agencies. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in the Department of Labor has taken the lead among the government agencies. Its interest comes from its charge to assure a healthful workplace for all employees, but the federal agencies responsible for assuring equal treatment of men and women in employment also are involved, principally the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Just last week, these two agencies issued joint guidelines to employers on which programs aimed at protecting workers' offspring they would consider non-discriminatory. And of course, the chemical companies are involved. So far, their role remains the key one. For individually, they are still setting personal policies within their companies. There were no uniform federal guidelines until last week, and it is still too early to see the impact of new guidelines on company policies. Labor unions and other workers' rights groups for now are aiming their efforts primarily at influencing the government to control the companies tightly. They have only begun in a small way any direct action against the companies themselves. The most recent cases to draw public attention have centered on the question of women working in certain areas, but women workers are only part of the issue. Men, too, can be affected by the exposure to certain chemicals, and such exposure could very likely cause abnormalities in offspring. A case in point is that of chemical workers at a New Yorkers. Rensselaer, New York chemical plant that made Autism, a herbicide sold by Eli Lilly & Co. for control of weeds in soybean and fruit crops. Last November, the International Chemical Workers Union urged OSHA to shut down the Rensselaer plant and the Environmental Protection Agency to ban the use of Autism, charging that the Lilly herbicide was responsible for birth defects or miscarriages among the offspring of 5 male workers at the facility. According to the union, no normal pregnancies occurred in the families of the 110 workers at the plant during the 18 months that the compound was being produced there. Oh my God. According to the union, no normal pregnancies occurred in the families of the 110 workers at the plant during the 18 months that the compound was being produced there. That's statistically significant. But 3 children were born with heart defects. A 4th, who died of pneumonia 2 months after birth, also may have had a heart defect, and the 5th pregnancy ended in miscarriage. In each case, it was only the fathers of the children who worked with Autism. OSHA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health are... when an old paper has been photocopied a million times, when OSHA and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health are looking into the union's claims about Autism, both at the Rensselaer plant, New Yorkers, and at other locations where Autism is made. So far, according to ICWU General Counsel Salvatore J. Valletta, NIOSH has not found any evidence of harm to offspring of workers at the other locations. This does not mean the problem, Valletta points out. It may, for instance, be handled differently at the other locations, posing a hazard only at the Rensselaer site. OSHA's final report on the question is expected in the next few weeks. Eli Lilly says that the birth defects among the families of workers at the Rensselaer plant are multiple coincidences and have nothing to do with exposure of the fathers to Autism or its precursors. This is the conclusion of the New York Institute of Birth Defects and doctors at the Albany Medical Center, who began investigating the cases since the first of the children were born in 1976, the company says. Oh my God. Sorry. They photocopied this and I have to pick up on, I don't know what was before this. Occupational exposure to certain chemicals and effects on male reproductive function is that of DBCP, a soil fumigant used to control nematodes. Studies in laboratory animals and human data indicate that exposure to relatively low levels of this compound can reduce sperm counts enough to cause sterility. When data of the effects on human workers became public in 1977, the 2 major U.S. producers of DBCP, Dow Chemical and Shell Chemical, both stopped making it. OSHA quickly issued temporary emergency standards for exposure to non-agricultural workers of 10 ppb in the air, parts per billion. EPA's restricted use of the compound to a limited number of crops, chiefly citrus fruits, in 1977. Even these uses are now being challenged, however, since data gathered last summer show unexpectedly high levels of DBCP in drinking water near agriculture areas. There is also concern that DBCP may cause birth defects in the children of workers exposed to it. One suit is underway involving California DBCP workers who claim that their sons were born with defective penises because of the workers' exposure to the chemical. That is unfortunate. However, probably the compound attracting the most attention because of its possible effects on male fertility or on offspring through the father's exposure is 2378 tetrachloro... Chemists, give me a second. 2378 tetrachloroodine benzopdioxin, the contaminant in Agent Orange, the military herbicide used in Vietnam. I'm going to be calling it Agent Orange from now on, but yeah, I would worry about that. Suits and countersuits have been filed in federal courts concerning the exposure of about 3,000 Vietnam veterans to the compound. A Vietnam veterans group that is suing on behalf of these veterans claim, among other things, that exposure to the herbicide led to loss of sexual ability in the men and malformations in their children. Although the veterans sued Shew charges birth defects associated with Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam. Data on this point are not uniformly accepted as conclusive. NIOSH is in the midst of a multi-generation study with rodents designed to show whether exposure to the chemical by the father can cause defects in the offspring, and at least one of the chemical companies that supplied the Defense Department with Agent Orange during the Vietnam War is conducting a massive study of its workers who made the herbicide photocopy issue, determine whether there have been any reproductive effects in this group. Okay. Despite the very real concern over reproductive hazards to men arising from exposure to hazardous chemicals in the workplace, the focus of this issue at the moment is on women. Nearly all chemical companies and a great many toxicologists generally maintain that there are chemicals that can damage a developing embryo or fetus, but are not harmful to a healthy male or female adult. Controlling water exposure to these substances is causing most of the current concern. Not everyone agrees with this point. Anthony Mazzacci, Director of Health and Safety for the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union, OCAW, for instance, says existing data do not show the fetus to be any more vulnerable to chemical damage than the sperm. We know of no substance that affects the fetus and not male sperm, Mazzacci says. The emerging government position appears to be somewhere in between these two views. That is, it does not state that a substance that affects the fetus must necessarily also affect the sperm, but it does caution companies that such effects are possible and cannot be ignored without the risk of the company being charged with sex discrimination. Companies whose workers are exposed to reproductive hazards in the workplace may not discriminate in the hiring or work assignments of Xerox issue their employers on the basis of sex, including pregnancy or childbirthing capacity, may need new federal guidelines, missions. Okay. Something's been cut out here. I'm just going to, of Labor Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP. I don't know what was said after before. Okay. Companies may establish neutral policies to protect employees and their offspring from reproductive hazards, but they must be certain that in practice, the plans do not adversely affect only one sex. However, the new guidelines do allow for, quote, temporary exclusion of workers of one sex only from a workplace under certain conditions. The first of these is that there be reputable scientific evidence that the hazard is likely to harm only one sex or only pregnant employees. The employer also must show that it has thoroughly searched the scientific literature and cannot find evidence of a similar hazard for the non-excluded sex. Finally, companies must begin within 6 months research projects to find out whether the chemicals in question also produce adverse reproductive effects in the non-excluded sex. These research projects are to be conducted under, quote, accepted scientific methods and produce results within 2 years. Okay, so therein lies the rub. Let's read this again. However, the new guidelines do allow for temporary exclusion of workers of one sex only for a workplace under certain conditions. The first is that there be reputable scientific evidence that the hazard is likely to harm only one sex or only pregnant employees. You're not gonna find that. The employer also must show that it has thoroughly searched the scientific literature and cannot find evidence of a similar hazard for the non-excluded sex. It's gonna be quite easy to search the literature and not find shit. Finally, the companies must begin within 6 months research projects to find out whether the chemicals in question also produce adverse reproductive effects in the non-excluded sex. Women are banned from clinical trials. These research projects are to be conducted under, quote, accepted scientific methods and produce results within 2 years. Chronic effects. So this is just bullshit. This is what women are dealing with at the time. For now, these are only proposed guidelines. Chemical companies and others are being given 120 days to comment on them before they come out in final form. The EEOC OFCCP position reflects concerns sounded earlier in statements by officials at both NIOSH and OSHA in a letter last month to BF Goodrich's manager of industrial relations, F.R. Pruitt, for example. NIOSH Director Anthony Robbins discussed the lack of adequate data in some cases for establishing safe levels of exposure to certain chemicals for an unborn embryo or fetus. Quote, we must, however, stand firm on the principle that if an exposure is sufficiently toxic to produce genetic damage in an unborn child or in a fertile female, then it must be considered to be equally toxic to the fertile male worker and to his unborn child, Robbins says. There is a priori no reason to believe that the genetic material of a male worker is any way more resistant to toxic occupational injury than that of the female. In addition, we feel that workers of both sexes should be counseled counseled regarding the nature of the materials with which they work and the potential toxic effects on them and on their offspring. I just think that you should tell people, yeah, some of this is like not safe to work with, regardless if you have kids or not. They're like, hey guys, ladies, you could have babies someday. We're just going to be super paternalistic and like kind of like in a way discriminate against you openly. If that's all right. Oh, Mrs. Abzug, why are you yelling at me? She's always so flamboyant and confrontational. Oh my God. I mean, she's kind of upset with me. She represents women's rights. We just did this sort of like mass discrimination thing. And then I said last November, I have 15 minutes for you, Mrs. Abzug. And now she's snapping off at me in front of other people because I said, hey, fuck you guys. Okay. So Robin's letter marks a definite change from the agency's standpoint on the question, and in the early 1970s in Xerox issue. 1974, for example, NIOSH found scientific that vinyl chloride recommended that, quote, any woman who is pregnant or expects to become pregnant should be employed directly in vinyl chloride monomer operations. What is should or shouldn't? In his letter to Goodrich, Robbins now says that companies that keep women of childbearing age from working in certain areas based on the 1974 NIOSH recommendation could be guilty of sex discrimination. OSHA Administrator Eula Bingham has been warning companies for several years that her agency does not like policies that exclude workers from unhealthful workplaces just to avoid cleaning up the workplace. Companies should be careful, in particular, she has said, of focusing their concerns for fetal safety only on the hazards that may come by the way of the mother. Quote, concern for female reproductive capacity and the fetus is praiseworthy, but experience is demonstrating that any given substance may be equally damaging to the male reproductive system and through the male to the fetus. I believe that attention must be focused on hazards faced by all workers, men as well as women, she stated in a letter to corporate medical directors in 1978. Quote, OSHA is convinced that the mere exclusion of workers does nothing to eliminate the hazard, which is purported to justify exclusion, Bingham also says, quote, and that such exclusion is not intended by the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The laws of this nation are committed to guaranteeing both healthful working conditions and equal employment opportunity. I believe, therefore, that employers should exhaust all possible avenues of worker protection. Yes, be they engineering controls, work practices, personal protective equipment, etc., before considering the adoption of exclusionary employment practices. Yes. This is how stupid they are. Women, something could go wrong with their period. What about the men? Dude, these men are getting infertile and like having like issues. Oh my God. And they're like, okay, let's just be sexist and discriminate instead of investing in worker protection and kind of testing the chemicals we're exposing people to. No, discrimination, cheaper. Ban the women. Discriminate. Okay. Nevertheless, every chemical company contacted by C&EN maintains, at least in principle, that women who are biologically capable of pregnancy cannot be allowed to work in areas where phytotoxic chemicals are found at levels that could damage an embryo or fetus, regardless of whether the women actually are pregnant. These policies come about because major malformations, if they occur at all during a pregnancy, occur during the period from the 14th to the 40th day when the major organ systems are being formed, and companies do not consider it possible to detect pregnancy in women workers and remove them to a safe workplace before that critical period. Thus, unless safe exposure levels for these chemicals can be established for the fetus and working exposures kept below that level, certain work areas are not open for fertile women. Whether such a policy in principle illegally discriminates against women is being widely argued among the groups that are concerned with this issue, and even in the principle itself is allowed. The question still arises as to how well the personnel policies of individual companies adhere to it. Do companies sometimes act illegally to keep women out of certain kinds of jobs in the name of protecting their unborn children? Such questions will almost certainly be resolved ultimately in the courts. The first case in the area may be approaching the courts now. And so then they talk about like court cases where people are working in industrial settings and they're women and they're like, I have a vagina, I want to work here. So people are suing. And so if you're like, it is kind of interesting, women of childbearing age. Was it the thalidomide tragedy? Well, it's because a lot of big oil and chemical companies, industrial companies, wanted to discriminate And instead of like protecting any worker in general, they were like, we want to be able to discriminate and save money on research. It's a very intricate plan. We're going to make men sick. Everyone who could possibly have a conflict of interest is in the White House right now. Right? We have like a whole bunch of corporations, and a lot of them, big oil, big agriculture, like we got like, so many like big companies, and we're having to test their chemicals and the stuff they sell in food and the stuff they put on food. They're already being charged so much. Do you know how much research is? How long it takes? And so like all we want to do is discriminate against women and save us some money. So yeah, I'm going through all these lawsuits and then scrolling down. So they talk about OSHA, the more and better data on reproductive hazards would be useful. OSHA's call for temporary removal of women from areas that present fetal hazards rather than permanent exclusion from these areas during their reproductive lives is another matter. So they contact a whole bunch of chemical companies who are like, we're just gonna like move them out or fire them legally. And they said this attitude is based on part of medical argument, but it stems too from legal considerations. Legally, the fetus is not an employee and it did not choose to be in the work environment, nor is it capable of either understanding the hazards it may be exposed to or of waiving its rights to protection against these hazards. Also, like, it's not a real fucking human being. It doesn't exist. You're like, what if this it's like literally like men are the ultimate like TikTok comments. What if this baby who doesn't exist yet gets strep throat because of exposure to, I mean, you'd get worse than strep throat, but it's like you're arguing a hypothetical, and I'm assuming in most court cases you can't, but I guess there's exceptions for like, don't you have to have like an actual fucking like, you can't be like, you can't make cases for like a hypothetical situation, like laws anyway. So worker injuries are covered by workmen's compensation laws designed to speed up settlements of liability claims, but which also limit an employer's liability toward the worker, but the fetus is legally a third party. Oh, fuck. If it's damaged but not killed, the person it becomes can sue for any amount of compensation it can convince a jury is justified. Cases that have gone to court concerning malformations caused by exposure to thalidomide and other drugs in utero lead chemical companies to view this potential liability as enormous, and their health policies reflect a determination to avoid such claims. Why were women banned from research? The thalidomide tragedy, it was because companies could get sued by chemical exposure toxins that they didn't test, that they don't want to test, that they don't want to research the effects of. So it's like, oh, we want to protect. No, it's so all these companies I'm about to list don't have to spend money in court. So there was a whole bunch of lawsuits, toxicology reports. Some chemical company toxicologists such as Bernard A. Schwetz, director of toxicology research at Dow Chemical, share infants concerned about the need for more data on reproductive effects. I don't think we should overreact to this one potential source of hazard harm to the fetus. Schwetz says we need to remember that there are other potential routes of harm and study them all. Didn't study them, or if they did study them, you can also read about, like, I'm going to include a paper about the research they did do. It was bad as shit. Awful conditions were just, there's no control. It was bad. Sorry, I just need to read this again. Worker injuries are covered by workmen's compensation laws designed to speed up settlement of liability claims, but which also limit an employer's ability toward the worker. But the fetus is legally a, quote, third party. If it is damaged but not killed, the person it becomes can sue for any amount of compensation it can convince a jury is justified. Cases that have gone to court concerning malformations caused by exposure to thalidomide and other drugs in utero led chemical companies to view this potential liability as enormous, and their health policies reflect the determination to avoid such claims. They literally, all of these people are in the government, and OSHA, before Jimmy Carter got into be president, was like, hey, you need to start studying women, and there's a whole bunch of like things that we're going to outline. I'm going to include that below. OSHA's like, you need to take women's issues seriously, and then Jimmy Carter gets in the fucking office, and then yeah, this is a quote. We'd rather go to bat with the regulatory agencies over possible job discrimination caused by a health policy than run the risk of open-ended liability should a malformed child result, one chemical company lawyer says frankly. Yeah, we'd rather just discriminate against them. But the thing is these are not only exposures in like the actual industrial setting. These products are also going out, being consumed or used by the public. So it's like, oh, it's just even useless to not study. Oh, they're not in the context. Well, things kind of like bleed into certain like liquids and things diffuse, right? Like it's just the stupidest. Oh my God. If the government really wants the responsibility for deciding whether to accept the risks of exposure to phytotoxic substances in early pregnancy to rest with the employee, says Joseph B. Wallenberger, corporate labor counsel for Monsanto, all that needs to be done is to pass a law saying that companies that are following all of the OSHA regulations have no further liability should workers have malformed children. Such a law would be ridiculous, he adds. The responsibility is the company's, and that is where it should stay. The ideal position on fetal hazards, most companies agree, is to be able to identify safe levels for each of these compounds and keep exposure below these levels everywhere the chemicals are used. Few companies claim to be able to do that in all cases, however. Monsanto's McEwen sums up what could be the attitude of all chemical employers. The notion that every job ought to be available to every person just isn't true, he says. There is no such thing as risk-free environment. As more and more non-traditional jobs open up for people, there are going to be, Xerox issue. I don't know what there's going to be. Monsanto identifies mercury and 2 other compounds as posing particular hazards to the fetus in the work environment. Often the company has been able, through effective agencies, to bring exposure to those chemicals to safe levels, and women are allowed to work in these areas, says James H. Sproul, a senior physician in the Department of Medicine and Environmental Health. However, sometimes they feel, quote, uneasy about exposure at a particular location. Then says Sproul, it's reasonable to ask women not to work there. It's not reasonable. Just study the... Okay. I mean, you also have men who have their exposure. Do you think like men are impervious? Okay. Altogether, Monsanto has about 150 jobs, which it does not allow fertile women to hold. Out of about 50,000 jobs in the U.S., probably less than half these jobs have ever been held by women, since men are also eligible for these positions. And also, historically, women have not been able to work. This policy is no different from the way the company handles other types of hazards that affect only certain groups of employees, explains Ray E. Witter, Director of Safety and Property Protection. Monsanto does not allow colorblind people, usually men, to work as electricians, for example, since they cannot distinguish the different colors which key electrical wiring, nor are people who lack certain kinds of trucks where this deficiency could be a hazard. It's not a medical deficiency, you don't own a truck. And it would make sense for people who are colorblind in this moment to be excluded from certain things when it comes to electrical if they can't distinguish the colors. However, they're talking about just the hypothetical baby that could exist, okay? DuPont treats reproductive and fetal hazards in the same way. It treats any other hazard from chemical exposure, says Carr. All hazardous chemicals are controlled for their most potent hazard. Thus, for example, hexafluoroacetone is viewed by DuPont as being hazardous both because of its possible effects on male reproduction and for its fetotoxicity. However, the acceptable threshold limit value to protect against the effect on men, 0.1 part per million, is lower than would be needed to protect a fetus. So the company controls for the male reproductive effect and automatically protects the fetus as well. So much of OSHA's Bingham has recommended. Carr says DuPont tries to limit worker exposure to toxic chemicals first by engineering means, then by modifying work practices so that the job is done without people having to enter the high exposure areas, and then by administrative practices that limit the amount of time that workers spend exposed to hazardous chemicals. If all of these measures still leave fertile women unacceptable exposed to a fetotoxic substance, then the company excludes them from that job. DuPont has 6 compounds found in the workplace that it identified as hazardous to the fetus. They are Xerox issue, but thankfully they're all chemicals. Yes. Okay. I can't read it. For all of those compounds except lead, the company has established safe exposure levels for the fetus and allows women to work with these compounds if the exposure can be kept below these levels. Hey, just spoiler. Lead also really fucks up men too. I don't know. Okay. The level set for lead is the background level, since the company has not been able to establish any level that presents no risk to the fetus. Carr says DuPont recently has been able to bring exposure levels for dimethylacetamide to below its safety level at all locations where the chemical is used, so no women are excluded from working with this substance. However, for each of the other 5 compounds, there are some areas where fertile women are not allowed to work. Women who are working in these areas where the policy went into effect were transferred to other comparable jobs. Carr says he is reasonably sure that no woman has ever been denied employment or terminated because of this policy, and that he is not aware of any women who has ever been moved to a job with lower pay. Shell Chemical is still trying to draft a formal policy for protecting the fetus. It doesn't, okay, says Howard L. Kushnetz, corporate manager of safety and hygiene for all Shell operations in the U.S. Shell is collecting information from the literature and its own toxicological research on the reproductive effects of the compounds it manufactures. The company also is carrying out special examinations of its workers where there is a suggestion that a compound might pose a hazard. So far, these workers' studies have not turned up any hazards. That's crazy. That in-house toxicology reports from Shell have not shown any hazards. I wouldn't have expected that. We have the dual function of protecting the worker and protecting Xerox issue. I don't know. It's deprived of economic opportunity. Kuntz says Dow Chemical set up a special task force that labored for 4 years to come up with a policy on reproductive hazards, says Personal Relations Director Frank P. Hammond. The policy controls exposure to fetotoxic materials whenever possible. When that is not possible, women capable of reproduction are not allowed to work in areas where they might be subject to hazardous exposure. Dow has a fetal toxicity group, which is responsible for analyzing and evaluating all chemicals used at Dow for possible fetal toxicity. All chemicals are put into 3 categories, explains Benjamin B. Holder, Dow's medical director. They are either fetal toxins for which there is no known safe level of exposure. Dow has yet to put anything into this category. Suspected fetotoxins that do have a safe exposure level, or chemicals that are not toxic to the fetus. Unlike many other chemical makers, Holder says, Dow is able to keep exposures at all its locations below the levels it considers safe. Thus, women may work anywhere at Dow. Holder attributes Dow's ability to do this a little bit to luck. There are some chemicals, such as lead, that cause other companies problems and that Dow does not work with. It's quite possible that we have at some time, and this is a quote, it's quite possible that we might at some time have one plant where exposure couldn't be kept down to an acceptable level, Holder says. Then we would temporarily transfer the women out and get the level lower. Hammond says, I suspect if we ever found a substance that had no safe exposure level for fetal toxicity, we would lean really hard towards not handling it. And then there's a Xerox issue. I cannot read the rest. So yeah, guys, there's nothing we could do except discriminate. There's really nothing. And men, you know that men are impervious to lead. They are. Like, they just... Anyway. So, why were women banned from clinical research? Well, you could thank Monsanto, DuPont, Shell Chemical, Dow Chemical, General Motors, Borden, Firestone Tire. Where am I getting those last ones? From some toxic docs that I will link below. All right. I just want to say, if you're like, who all is in big business that's in Jimmy Carter's administration? I've talked about some. This is a New York Times article from February 5th, 1978. Washington. When Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer populist, first took office, he courted small business leaders and left his staff to deal with big business. During the last 6 months, however, the president has done dramatic about-face. Quote, he started off good, says James D. McKevitt. Sadly, he is Washington counsel of the National Federation of Independent Business, which has 525,000 small business members. Quote, now things are different with all those big shooters in the Oval Office. Irving S. Shapiro, chairman of E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, and an archetypal, quote, big shooter, expressed another attitude toward the same development. Quote, the president started out on the premise that he should not personally be involved. Now he is accessible. He talks. We have no trouble getting ourselves heard. This is what the chairman of DuPont said. We have no trouble getting ourselves heard. In fact, big business has the ear of Jimmy Carter, Democrat, to a greater degree than was true of Richard M. Nixon and Gerald R. Ford, Republicans, and some of the business establishment. Leaders say they are getting along better with Mr. Carter than they did with his predecessors. Whether the president or his visitors will reap any really significant or lasting benefits from their contracts, however, remains to be seen. The businessmen closest to the president have been the leaders of the Business Roundtable, made up of 180 chief executive officers of the nation's largest corporations. The roundtable represents more concentrated economic power and political clout than any other business organization in the country. Mr. Shapiro and Reginald H. Jones, chairman of the General Electric Company, appear to be the two most influential with Mr. Carter. But White House sources say that Thomas A. Murphy, chairman of the General Motors Corporation, and John D. DeButz, chairman of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, are in contention. Mr. Jones, Mr. Shapiro, and Mr. Murphy are currently the three co-chairmen of the roundtable. Mr. Murphy last year replaced Mr. DeButz as co-chairman. Mr. DeButz, 62-year-old, is said to be the most outgoing and least restrained of the four. Mr. Murphy, who has spent 90 years of his working career at General Motors, is described by a White House observer as, quote, a quick talker and very articulate. He spent 90 years as a... Oh my God. How old is he? Mr. Jones and his staff at GE have developed an unusual expertise on federal tax policy, and he is often consulted on such matters, not only by the White House, but also by Treasury Secretary W. Michael Blumenthal. The 60-year-old Mr. Jones is said to be, quote, quite articulate, but quieter than DeButz. And so just a reminder that Mr. Blumenthal was kicked out as Secretary of the Treasury in 1979, so I'm assuming that he got replaced by someone because money. Okay, Mr. Shapiro, 61 years old, has moved up rapidly at DuPont and in the roundtable ranks, where he's credited by colleagues with providing, quote, new ideas and a recognition that we have to work with both political parties. The emergence of such business leaders who are less dogmatic than our counterparts of the past have eased the way for a dialogue with President Carter. One such business spokesman who is somewhat less conservative in his views is R. Heath Larry, president of the National Association of Manufacturers and former vice president of the United States Steel Corporation. Several weeks ago, President Carter met privately with Mr. Larry in the Oval Office for 30 minutes. The women only got 15. What the hell, man? Mr. Larry said that he found the president, quote, inquisitive and desirous of learning. Oh, God. One White House source said that Mr. Carter is talking with Mr. Larry, quote, as often as he talks with any businessman. According to S. Steven Selig, 3D, a Carter aide who was once in the real estate business in Georgia and who now works on White House liaison with the business community, the Carter administration checks out with roundtable leaders many of its proposed appointees to high federal office. Quote, it's better to have their pre-knowledge, even if not their agreement, he says. For instance, President Carter's nominees to become the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, G. William Miller, chairman of Textron Inc., is an old friend of Secretary Blumenthal. But before nominating the 52-year-old Mr. Miller, the White House conferred with Mr. Jones and Mr. Shapiro, as well as with A.W. Clausen, chairman of the Bank of America. When I tell you, he's just listening to... Okay, my God. Mr. Clausen is said by an aide to Secretary Blumenthal to be, quote, very highly thought of in the Carter administration. Okay, also, you know how I was talking about good jobs first? Look up Bank of America. If you want to see the number one, company with violations. Bank of them. Okay. Another roundtable member who has come to the ear of the administration to an increasing degree is Mr. Murphy of General Motors, who recently had a private dinner with Mr. Blumenthal. And playing an even hand among the major automakers, Secretary Blumenthal met privately in Detroit several weeks ago with about 20 Michigan business and banking leaders at hotel reception with Henry Ford, 2D chairman of the Ford Motor Company, as host. Mr. Ford was also one of the hosts at a 1976 luncheon at New York's Elegant 21 Club, where candidate Carter was introduced to some 50 corporate chairmen and presidents. Another host of that 1976 luncheon was J. Paul Austin of Atlanta, chairman of the Coca-Cola Company. Mr. Austin is a longtime friend of President Carter and remains a somewhat advisor to the president, according to Carter aides. So I just want to remind you that this was published February 5th, 1978. And J. Paul Austin replaced James R. Schlesinger. So that is so great that Coca-Cola he's like a really good friend. And he's like sometimes like a advisor to Mr. Carter in 1978, 1979. Welcome to the team, bud. Welcome to the team. We just kicked that other guy out. And so now you're the Secretary of Energy. We're having issue with your plastic products and your plastic products. So come on in, guys. All right. A leader of the financial community who is occasionally consulted is William M. Batten, New York Stock Exchange chairman, in whose office Secretary Blumenthal recently met with about 24 investment bankers. Mr. Blumenthal is also said to, quote, remain in touch with Walter B. Ritson, chairman of Citicorp. The president's more recent meetings with selected big businessmen have included a few who are not business roundtable members or registered Republicans. Ben W. Heinemann, for example, chairman of Northwest Industries, Inc., last month took part in a White House session with President Carter. Mr. Heinemann is a Democrat and is not a roundtable member. He is also not ordinarily consulted by the Carter White House, although he was very influential at the Johnson White House. A major missing presence in Mr. Carter's meetings with the big business is big oil. There are no major oil company executives within the administration's inner circle or business advisors. The president's difficulties with his energy program and his tendency to blame the oil industry are seen as explanations. The president's difficulties with his energy program, he fired the guy who was in the energy program and put Coca-Cola there, Secretary of Energy, and his tendency to blame the oil industry are seen as explanations. Trust, after 1978, that all turns back around, because that women's article I read about Shell and all them, that was 1980. Trust me, Mr. Carter gets in with big oil. The president's decision to make himself available to big business leaders seems clear, is rooted in a desire to spur business confidence, and with it, the level of capital spending. The specific occasion for his turnaround, however, is uncertain. We don't know. Some cite Mr. Carter's September meeting with a group of business leaders who told him that his personal communication with influential big businessmen was essential. Quote, he has responded by changing his style, one said, citing Mr. Carter's appearance at a December meeting of the Business Council, another organization of leading executives. Quote, he'd been invited to appear before, but he always said he had prior commitments, the businessman said. This time he had his photograph taken with various business leaders and sent them autographed copies of the photo. There is also speculation that Treasury Secretary Blumenthal and Robert S. Strauss, the president's special representative for trade negotiations, were principally responsible for convincing Mr. Carter to seek closer big business ties. And some suggest that it was only after the forced resignation of Burt Lance as director of office management and budget that the president really began warming up toward business leaders. So Burt Lance was the banker who really closely invested with banks in Georgia, worked a lot with Coca-Cola. Mr. Lance had been viewed as the president's link to big business. He was personally acquainted with many roundtable members. The Georgia banker remains close to the president. He unobtrusively spent at least 2 days at the White House while Mr. Carter was in the final throes of preparing the 1979 budget. He's been fired, but he's still at the White House. Been fired for ethics shits. But Mr. Lance can no longer take public role as the president's big business connection, and Mr. Carter himself had little of the acquaintance in the ranks of big business that Mr. Nixon and Mr. Ford had acquired after years of on the national scene. President Carter had thus had to start more or less from scratch, with the result that he is spending more time with big business leaders than his Republican predecessors, who could take roundtable support pretty much for granted. Few of the businessmen close to President Nixon and Ford are to be seen in the White House these days. Thus, Coca-Cola, in the person of Mr. Austin, is in, but Donald M. Kendall, chairman of PepsiCo Inc., is out. In the Carter White House, Mr. Kendall is regarded as too much of a Republican loyalist. The names of Bryce Harlow, former chief Washington representative of the Procter & Gamble Company, and William G. White, who long held a similar post with U.S. Steel, once close friends and golfing companions of President Ford, are heard no more. Some business leaders who have had taste of both the Nixon-Ford administration and the current administration say they like the change, said one who is among the closest to the White House. Quote, although I supported him almost to the very end, I always found that Nixon was inclined to come into business meeting and give a 20-minute lecture and then disappear without waiting to hear what we thought. Mr. Ford was not much better, he added. All of which is not to say that the roundtable members feel any sense of intimacy in their contacts with Mr. Carter. Several of them speak of the president's, quote, apparentness. He does not mix with them socially. Quote, when Carter meets with us, one said, it's strictly business. He has some purpose in mind, and that's fine with me. Nor is there any indication that Mr. Carter takes all the advice he is receiving from big business leaders. He still styles himself in the anti-establishment president. He is not proposing to cut federal spending the way they would like, and he wants to pare down the tax deductions on business luncheons and other such prerequisites. What then have the president and his visitors achieved with their meetings? There is thus far little sign of a surge in business confidence in the nation, said one roundtable member, quote, I think business still is not all that gung-ho on him. We have been able to swat a few flies, but I don't get the feeling that much ice has been broken yet. Well, it's still 1978, guys. From Mr. Carter's point of view, however, the reaction of the roundtable to the president's tax program and other economic proposals have been heartening. A roundtable news release hailed the effort to hold down any major increase in federal spending and even had more praise than criticism for the plans to curb wage and price raises in as much as, quote, we have been assured that the administration will seek to work quietly with both management and labor. The close contact between big business leaders and Mr. Carter currently shows no sign of diminishing, and the White House professes to be content with the process, said one aide with some satisfaction, quote, Reg Jones and Erie Shapiro now are Carter people. So that's fucked. What's interesting, though, is like I was talking about, women banned from clinical research in 1977, women of childbearing potential. It wasn't for the thalidomide tragedy. It's because like all these big ass companies, Coca-Cola included, and then later, you know, all these chemical and oil companies, surprisingly, they did warm up to Mr. Carter because there was no real change, no real regulation. So immunotoxicology, the field, is on the rise, late 70s, 80s. And so, like I was talking about, and in some of these articles, they were like reverse sexism, like making a point with like research. They're like, how come all this research is supposed to focus on women's reproductive health? Like a lot of our men are, you know, becoming infertile or cannot maintain an erection. And so, you know what they do in the late 70s, early 80s, is that they start to invest billions into erectile dysfunction research. I have a review of historical treatments of erectile dysfunction. Erectile dysfunction research shifted in the early 1980s from being considered purely psychological to having an organic basis. A 1983 discovery by Dr. Giles Brinley demonstrated that injecting vasodilators directly into the penis induced erections. By the mid to late 1980s, the FDA approved the first self-injectable drugs and launched foundational research efforts like the Massachusetts Male Aging Study. I get it. EDs can suck. Let's just also kind of consider this. Ban women from research. Don't study them because they're getting sick and they want a way to discriminate against them without getting sued. Men's health concern is more focused on erectile dysfunction. And while that is unfortunate, in the 1980s, they realized erectile dysfunction is not purely psychological. It has an organic basis. And they're discovering like a whole bunch of like, with immunotoxicology, they're realizing, oh, men are getting ED from sort of like chemical exposures. The list of chemical exposures is going to be everything in the tox toxic docs. It's the same exposure. It's the same chemicals that they're worried about with, the fetus having malformations and then getting sued. So all these men, they're realizing, oh my God, we're investing this multi-year, decade-long studies about men's erectile dysfunction research. We're laying down some foundational research. We invested billions because some chemicals, right, are causing erectile dysfunction. At the same time, in mental health, I have to remind you, in the 1980s, the DSM-3 gets an update. 1980. In the 1980s, the official psychiatric diagnosis for somatization was fundamentally restructured with the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. The American Psychiatric Association shifted away from subjective terms like hysteria or Briquette syndrome, introducing a highly specific symptom-counting diagnostic framework to identify chronic, medically unexplained physical complaints. So, why this is fucked up, like I said, with the somatization disorder thing, they come up with the term somatization disorder. And it's a way to rebrand hysteria, Briquette syndrome, and hypochondria and put it into something that's politically correct, not correct for the time, right? They can't call women hysterical anymore. So, what they list in for the diagnosis, this is from the DSM-4. Let me see if I could, the DSM-4 and the DSM-3 are not too different. Actually, no, I do have. Where are you? Okay. They come up with somatization disorder and the related disorders. So for somatization disorder, here are the symptoms to classify you, to get you diagnosed with this mental disorder. Cardiopulmonal / autonomic arousal, palpitations, heart pounding, precordial discomfort, breathlessness without exertion, hyperventilation, hot or cold sweats, trembling or shaky dry mouth, churning in stomach, butterflies, or flushing or blushing. You have to have 3 or more of those. And then 3 or more of these. Gastrointestinal arousal, frequent loose bowel movements, abdominal pains, feeling bloated, full of gas, distended, heavy in the stomach, regurgitations, constipation, nausea, vomiting, burning sensation in chest or epigastrium. You have to have 3 or more of those. And then musculoskeletal tension, pains in arms or legs, muscular aches or pains, feelings of paresis or localized weakness, backache, pain moving from one place to another, unpleasant numbness or tingling sensations. 3 or more of those. General symptoms, concentration difficulties, impairment of memory, feeling tired, headache, memory loss, dizziness. There's also the DSM-4 criteria for somatization disorder. Each of the following criteria must be met with individual symptoms occurring at any time during the course of the disturbance. So this one, the DSM-4, came out in 94. 1, for pain symptoms, a history of pain related to at least 4 different sites or functions, example, head, abdomen, back, joints, extremities, chest, rectum, during menstruation, during sexual intercourse, or during urination. You have to have 2 gastrointestinal symptoms, a history of at least 2 gastrointestinal symptoms other than pain, example, nausea, bloating, vomiting, other than during pregnancy, diarrhea, or intolerance of several different foods. 3, 1 sexual symptom, a history of at least 1 sexual or reproductive symptom other than pain, example, sexual indifference, erectile or ejaculatory dysfunction, irregular menses, excessive menstrual bleeding, vomiting through pregnancy. 4, 1 pseudo-neurological symptom, a history of at least 1 symptom or deficit suggesting a neurological condition not limited to pain, conversion symptoms such as impaired coordination or balance, paralysis or localized weakness, difficulty swallowing or lump in throat, aphonia, urinary retention, hallucinations, loss of touch or pain sensation, double vision, blindness, deafness, seizures, dissociative symptoms such as amnesia or loss of consciousness other than fainting. Those are the diagnostic criteria for somatization disorder. What is interesting is that there's also a document I'm going to include about how companies are like, how do we deal with women's health, right? A lot more women go see like mental health professionals than men do, yes. And so what basically happened is that at the same time, men were getting billions of dollars in research for erectile dysfunction that had organic origins. It's not purely psychological. So research said, we're going to give you the money. It's not all in your head. There really are like environmental hazards that can be affecting you. The exact same time, women stripped out of research because chemicals, the same exact chemicals, causing like similar issues. And then they come up with a new somatization disorder, 1980, that happens to include gastrointestinal symptoms. And if I ever went to a doctor and I was like, I'm having a seizure, pain when I'm having sex, constant diarrhea, and chest pain, and my therapist told me I have somatization disorder, I'm suing. I'm not winning, but I'm suing. So what they said to women, it's too expensive to study you. We're giving billions of dollars to erectile dysfunction research. It's too expensive to study you. Because we want to discriminate and just like we could, what if your baby with malformation sues us? Baby that doesn't exist yet, third party. We don't want to do like any sort of like safety checks or like kind of just like phase out or like alert the public that these chemicals, it's not just an industrial setting, right? Discriminate, strip the research, and then these physical symptoms that you're experiencing are in your head. For men, money, not in your head. For women, physical, it's in your head, no money. And then in 1993, they're like, oh crap, we really gotta let women back in research because we're finding out a whole bunch more stuff. If any doctor tells you, when you tell them that you have like pain and gastrointestinal symptoms and, sexual symptoms and pseudoneurological symptoms, and they tell you that you're anxious or it's a somatization disorder was actually taken out of the DSM-5. Everything taken out of the DSM-5 was consolidated somatization disorder, undifferentiated somatoform disorder, and hypochondrias. They all put it into somatic symptom disorder. If your doctor has ever labeled you with somatic symptom disorder, they are telling you are hysterical. They are gaslighting you. And we're going to find about that in due time. This does remind me of, there was this I was looking up defunct and dying diseases. You're like, how does a disease die? It's basically like when a disease has been like kind of publicly prescribed to a lot of people, and then they realize there's like, oh, this is not a real disease, or like there's a cure for it or something else. There was this old disease called chlorosis. Now, I know everyone studying plants is like, chlorosis is but there was like a disease called chlorosis. I'm just going to touch on it because it's going to wrap up my point. I will include this below. This is from PubMed, Defunct and Dying Diseases. It was published September of 1970. So the virginal love sickness, and this is about defunct and dying diseases, published September 1970. What did happen to chlorosis? Quote, the green sickness, for example. The name was due to the greenish yellow color of the affected girls. The disease was also known as the love sickness because love, presumably unrequited, was believed to be an etiologic factor. Chlorosis had a long life beginning in 1520 when it was described as a disease of virgins until about 1912 when it virtually disappeared. It was interred with a rather belated obituary by W.M. Fowler in 1936. This disorder was believed to be a primary or, quote, essential anemia, quote, occurring in young girls due in part to hereditary influences, neurosis, ovarian insufficiency, autointoxication, or copronemia. It was thought to be the result of absorption of poisons, leucomanes, and ptomaines from the large bowel. Alternatively, it was ascribed to the wearing of tight corsets. Not too long before its demise, it became clear that the green sickness was an iron deficiency anemia caused by malnutrition with an inadequate intake of iron aggravated by infections, overwork, and poor sanitary conditions. Sir William Osler was aware that iron depletion was a characteristic feature of the disorder and that iron was a specific in the treatment of this condition. Curiously, he states, it is a minor matter how the iron cures chlorosis. Iron is present in the feces of chlorotic patients before they are placed on any treatment so that the disease does not result from any deficiency of available iron in the food. Since chlorosis was due to a deficiency of iron, and as this deficiency is not uncommon today, why do not the girls turn green anymore? We probably shall never know. The current bestseller by John Fowler entitled The French Lieutenant's Woman, which discusses some events in 1867, mentions the green sickness. Fowler relates that the doctor was called to, quote, look at an unfortunate maid and pronounced the diagnosis green sickness. The maid was subjected to the wrath of her mistress because she had neglected one Tuesday to water the ferns in the second drawing room. She narrowly escaped condig punishment by the discovery that she had fainted twice as a result of her illness. For treatment, Dr. Grogan recommended that she be moved out of the maid's dormitory and be given a room with more light. Her superior took upon herself much of the special care the chlorotic girl needed. Unfortunately, we are not told what the special care or other treatment was. As many gardeners know, chlorosis survives as a disease in green plants. Affected plants turn yellow or white. The treatment is adding iron chelates to the soil. So why this relates to this is, you want to know why chlorosis suddenly medically disappeared from 1912, this iron deficiency? It's because they discovered vitamins in the 1910s. And they were realizing, if you go through like more literature, like chlorosis always had to do something with love sickness and virgin and youth and being a little cherub, a little angel, and you're green because you're in love and your love is far away. Iron deficiency. And so when it comes to diseases and chronic conditions and shit that happens to women, history's bound to repeat itself. It always has some emphasis on like virginal fertility, right? Until we discovered vitamins. We're not even gonna. Don't talk about chlorosis. Don't talk about chlorosis anymore. It's that thing that happens in plants. They discovered vitamins in the 1910s. Malnutrition, overwork, unsanitary conditions. So continuing through this, through the timeline, they have all these virginal diseases. Oh, it's caused by malnutrition, some like chemical exposure, environmental exposure. And then, another virginal malady. Oh, we have to protect the third party. What if it... Okay, so like there's some chemicals that affect everyone, not just... Okay. So guys, that is this episode for today. It's really long. Don't care anymore. This is just so like messed up. I will say, the one part that is really great about this is that I love science, obviously, yes. But I've talked about this before. When it comes to environmental sciences, like you talk about atmosphere, you talk about pollution, you talk about environmental toxicology, this is where science just says, fuck it. I'm yelling at people. Because like a lot of time, like when it comes to, especially people who work with the ocean, marine biologists, oceanography, like when it comes to protecting the ocean, those scientists will beat the living shit out of you. And I had this hypothesis that this is half funny, but it's probably because like you're in international waters. When it comes to, can you assault someone? We're in international, that's a joke. But like when it comes to environmental sciences, it's just really nice. I'm saying, because a lot of science has this like calm, detached, respectability, sort of like, because I don't want to bias you with my emotions. When it comes to environmental sciences, these people will beat the shit out of you and scream in your face because it is that serious. As someone raised in a dysfunctional household with two very mean scientists and then a software engineer, it like feels like home. It's like, getting into an Uber where they smoke and then they're like, apologies for the cigarettes. And you're like, this is exactly where I want to be. Oh yeah, and then at the end of this, there's like a letter in Toxic Docs where Monsanto was like, okay, we're going to get in trouble for too many chemicals, so we have to make a pivot to something else. Like we really genuinely do. 1982, 83, they pivot to seeds. And that's where we get into the whole, I feel like I just did a prequel because I talked about Monsanto last time. And like when it comes to, oh my gosh, there was one document, I've looked through too many, where they were like, okay, so some of our products are like causing like a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I was like, this is from the 70s, 80s. If I can find that again, I'm going to send that to someone. However, though I was talking about statutes of limitations but proof that they did know, lawyers get in on this. And then, oh yeah, it is Disability Pride Month. And I did want to talk about some books that I would recommend for Disability Pride, just wrapping this up. The first one is Against Technoableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement by Ashley Shew. This is a really great one. Like a lot of people, for example, will say like, oh, AI helps disabled artists. The Technoableism, pick this one up. And then Disability Pride, Dispatches from a Post-ADA World by Ben Mattlin. Love this one. And then All Tangled Up in Autism and Chronic Illness, A Guide to Navigating Multiple Conditions by Charli Clement. Someone who is autistic with chronic illnesses, if you need help navigating the medical system, I would strongly recommend picking this up, whether you are autistic or not. That there's like, it talks about the research, how you should write things down when you like sort of, it's just a really great instructional guide. But yeah, happy Disability Pride. We're going to keep talking about this and more. But yeah, you guys should read this. Oh my God, the websites I wanted to direct you guys to. This is for a bunch of people who are just like in the sciences who want like cool websites that you could look at. So this is for everyone. There's the timeline for the history of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And it's a really, really cool, like this happens in this year. And so like if this is a lot of information, you're like, I want to learn about endocrine disrupting chemicals. Like what should I be looking out for? This is a really great timeline. It's nice, love a good visual representation. There's also this thing called Comparative Taxogenomics Database. And it's really cool because you can like put in like certain genes and then like how they interact with like certain toxins, which is really cool. I in 2021, I did like this brand partnership with a DNA company and they like checked out like my health history and I've just been typing in genetics things and I'm like, ooh, I should really get tested for like a gluten intolerance because this is not looking good. And then there's also Deduct, a database on endocrine disrupting chemicals and their toxicity profiles. I'm going to include that. And then University of California, San Francisco has Industry Documents Library. So I've also mentioned Toxic Docs, but then also University of California, their Industry Documents Library. If you're looking for something from all industries, tobacco, opioids, chemical, drug, food, fossil fuel, this is a really great resource if you're like, I want to know the dirt. And then also, if you are a physician and you're listening to this, I appreciate that. There's something called Physicians for Social Responsibility. It's just, I'm just adding this in case you were like, I want to connect with other like-minded physicians, who are trying to make a change in healthcare. They have like all their issues page and it's a way to connect with other professionals. They are talking about like fossil fuel pollution and radiation protections and stuff like that. And so if you're like a physician and you're new to like the toxicology space, but like also if you're like trying to look for other other physicians who are like new to this space, I was just going to recommend this, Physicians for Social Responsibility. It's just a great way to like get involved. And then there's also for scientists who care about this, you want to take part. There's also the Science Action Network for Health and the Environment, Advancing Health and Chemical Policy. And so basically the Science Action Network for Health and the Environment helps prevent toxic chemical exposures and improve public health. And they have 200 plus members who use their expertise to ensure that U.S. policy protects health, the environment, and future generations. And so that is for, it's like collaborate with scientific colleagues to inform science-based decision-making, share cutting-edge ideas, learn how to communicate science, promote scientific integrity. So I just want to share that because I know a lot of you are in medicine and you care about climate change and chemical hazards. So I would recommend for y'all Physicians for Social Responsibility. And then if you are like in research and a scientist and you'd like to get involved in this with other like-minded individuals, the Science Action Network for Health and the Environment is really great. Yeah, I would just recommend those. And then all the other databases are just really great if you want to research more. And then I'm going to include that resource for where to find free textbooks. You don't have to, but it's like if you're a big nerd like me. But thank you guys again so much for listening and letting me tack that on at the end. This is going to take a lot of us all together working on this. I know that every environmental scientist and environmental toxicologists, like science, they're probably screaming at the TV right now. But all of us finally getting on board, or just me and then some other people. I'm just recommending this. But we'll talk next week. Thank you guys. Bye.